Okay. Is this on?
So it's only mic for the camera, so you have to...
Okay, really project. Okay. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started tonight. My name is Andrea Carroll, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 2017...
there is no mic, so yeah.
It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2017 Northeast Ohio Public Policy Series. Tonight's program is titled Ohio Drug Price Relief Act Ballot Issue, A Look at Both Sides. Before I introduce tonight's moderator, I want to recognize and thank a few of the organizations who were especially instrumental in making this year's Public Policy Series possible. Our program partners are the Laura Alvin Siegel Lifelong Learning Program and Case Western Reserve University, the League of Women Voters, Cleveland.com, the Cuyahoga County Public Library, and the Lakewood Library. We are grateful to our corporate sponsor, First Interstate Properties, Ltd., for supporting the series. I want to remind everyone about our next upcoming public policy session. On November 16th at CCPL's Parma Snow branch, Andrew Tobias from Cleveland.com will moderate a session titled A Look at the Political Crystal Ball for 2018. During the question and answer portion of this evening's program, please write out your questions on the note cards provided, and I will collect the cards and bring them up to the panel. It is with great pleasure we welcome Jeremy Pelzer, a journalist from Cleveland.com, to the podium this evening. Jeremy covers Ohio government and politics for Northeast Ohio Media Group. Before Ohio, Pelzer was a State House reporter for newspapers and websites in Illinois, Colorado, and Wyoming. He served on the Colorado Capital Press Association's executive board and won a Wyoming Press Association award for covering that state's bark beetle epidemic. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Jeremy Pelzer, who will introduce all of our panelists.
Hi, thanks so much, Andrea, and I hope in the back that you can hear us. We have a great crowd tonight, full house, and that's wonderful. So thanks so much again for coming. If it's all right, I'll probably just stay here instead of going to the podium. So issue 2, if you don't know about it, you soon will. And actually, if you're here, if you're like a lot of Ohioans, you probably don't know much about it, at least according to the polling. So real quick, here's what we're going to be talking about tonight. So this is going to be initiated statute that's going to be on the ballot this November, in 7 weeks from today. And it's going to require the state, if passed, require the state to pay no more for prescription drug prices than the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. And the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs currently already negotiates a discount for its prescription drug prices. So it would affect, there's differing numbers about how many people and exactly whom this would affect. It would affect state employees. It would affect people on Medicaid. And probably a range of other people as well. So I will introduce our panel. Oh, first let's go through some housekeeping. Here's how we're going to do this. I'll introduce our panelists, and then we'll have them give opening statements for about 5 minutes. Then I'll ask a few questions for about, they'll have 2 minutes each, and we'll allow 1 minute rebuttals. And I'll keep them a little honest. We'll give them a little leeway, but not too much. And then after that, we'll take questions from you guys. You should have a note card and a pencil. If you don't know where it is, you're probably sitting on it. And we'll be collecting those during it, and then we'll take as many of those as we can and make sure we get as many questions answered as we can. So first of all, let me introduce on the far end, we have Matt Borges. He is the campaign manager for Ohio Taxpayers for Lower Drug Prices. That is the pro-issue 2 side. Before this, he was the chairman of the Ohio Republican Party. In the middle, we have Dr. J.B. Silvers. He is a healthcare finance expert and a professor at the Weatherhead School of Management at Case Western Reserve. And last but not least, we have Dale Butland. He is, you're going to be your anti-issue 2 speaker tonight, and he is communications director for Ohioans Against the Deceptive RX ballot issue, and he is also former chief of staff for the late Senator John Glenn. So give him a round of applause. So we will get right to it. We will start 5 minutes for Mr. Borges.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you all for being here. We're going to kind of, I think, do these from our seats a little bit because these microphones go right into those cameras there. All right. So I will do it seated. Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, what an incredible turnout. And so thank you all for participating and for being here tonight and for caring about issues that affect our state and affect our communities. Let me just ask for a quick show of hands. How many people have heard of Issue 2 before? How many people have heard of this? So we have a lot of folks who have heard about that in this room, and that's good. Let me ask another question. How many people think that drug prices are too high and that people pay too much for prescription medicine? Let me put my hand up there as well. Notice Dale's hand was not going up, and that's certainly understandable. Jeremy did a very good job, and thank you, Jeremy, for introducing what Issue 2 is, because you're going to hear a lot probably tonight, and you're going to see a lot on TV and hear things on the radio about things that Issue 2 is not. And what Issue 2 is exactly what Jeremy described. It is mandating that the state of Ohio not pay more for prescription medicine than the Department of Veterans Affairs currently pays. Why the Department of Veterans Affairs? Well, the Department of Veterans Affairs gets a federally mandated 24% discount on prescription drugs. And they get that because 25 years ago, drug companies got caught red-handed ripping off the VA. And so Congress intervened. 25 years ago, in 1992, we had a Republican president and a Democratic Congress, and believe it or not, they came together and actually passed a piece of legislation that helped Americans and helped veterans in particular. And it is a program that has worked for the VA extraordinarily well. They've been able to recognize, to realize those savings, and meanwhile, over the last 25 years, a lot of great things have happened, a lot of crazy things have happened, where not only do we have more advances in research and with the development of medicines that can actually save people's lives. So many of us, either whether it's ourselves, take prescription medicine, or our family members who rely on their prescriptions in order to survive. But prescription drug prices are going up at a rate of about 10 to 15% every year. Why? Well, I'll tell you why. Because nobody has put any stops in the marketplace so that when drug companies decide what they feel like, and a major purchaser of prescription drugs like the state, like the federal government, like big pharmaceutical companies, like insurance companies will pay. What's the maximum amount that they'll pay for a prescription drug? That's what they sell it for. And then when new drugs get introduced into the marketplace, they get sold at the same price. You would think when there's more competition, it would bring prices down, but that's not what happens. Because if there's a particular place in American society and government right now where the system is completely rigged against all of you, it's with the drug companies and the way that they have a stranglehold on the marketplace right now. How many people in here knew that the federal government, the Medicare program, is prohibited by statute from negotiating prices with drug companies? And who here thinks that makes sense? Of course it doesn't make sense. But drug companies spent last year alone, in 2016 alone, $250 million lobbying the federal government so that they can put things like that in place. Why? Because they're good people? Because they care about you? Because they want you to have access to care? Because they want to bring prices down? No way, folks. Don't buy it. So you're going to hear a lot of things about what this campaign is from our side. You'll hear a lot of things about what this campaign is not from their side. Remember this when you go to vote in November, and I hope we were able to answer a lot of your questions tonight, but if you want lower drug prices, you have to vote yes. And it's the big drug companies that want you to vote no.
I'm incredibly impressed that was 2 seconds under 5 minutes. That was
Oh, I got 2 more
great.
seconds.
That was great, yeah. So next we're going to hear from Dale Butland giving the opposition to issue 2.
I'm going to stand here so people in the back can see as well as hear. Look, everyone agrees that Ohioans need access to affordable prescription drugs, and nobody believes that more than I do. In fact, I've spent a good part of my working life in that fight. But I'm opposed to issue 2 because I believe it is truly bad public policy that would backfire to the detriment of our state and its people. And it's not just me who thinks that. Virtually every expert who has studied issue 2, including a former state budget director and 3 former Medicaid directors who served under both Democratic and Republican governors, say passing issue 2 would only make the affordable drug crisis even worse by raising drug costs for a majority of Ohioans and reducing access to needed medicines for some of our most vulnerable people. That's why a coalition of over 70 trusted statewide organizations representing veterans, business, labor, and well over 30,000 Ohio doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and hospitals, including Rainbow Babies right here in Cleveland Children's Hospital, are urging Ohioans to vote no this November. So let me just briefly explain a few of its biggest problems. First, issue 2 is unworkable. If it passes, Ohio would be prohibited from paying more for drugs than the lowest price paid by the VA. Now that sounds good until you realize that we can't know what the lowest VA price is. What we do know is that the VA gets a federally mandated 24% discount, but that's not the VA's lowest price. Because besides that mandated discount, the VA negotiates additional voluntary discounts, and under federal law, those discounts are not publicly disclosed. So if we don't know what those other discounts are, we can't know the VA's lowest price, which means issue 2 would set a benchmark that is impossible for the state to meet. But even if the VA's lowest price could be known, issue 2 still wouldn't lower drug prices for most Ohioans because, and this is important, it only applies to drugs purchased by the state government, which means that issue 2 leaves out everyone who doesn't get their drugs through state programs, which is nearly 2 out of every 3 Ohioans. Now, Matt asked to see a show of hands. I'd like to do the same. If you have private insurance, if you have insurance provided by your employer or your spouse's employer, if you're on Medicare, or if you have no insurance at all, please raise your hand. Now, take a look around. None of you are included in issue 2. But hey, we're all taxpayers, right? So even if most people aren't covered, wouldn't we all benefit from this $400 million a year that the yes side says issue 2 would save the state? No, because the alleged $400 million savings is as phony as the claim that everyone's drug prices are going to go down. Remember, issue 2 only applies to drugs that are purchased by the state government. And Medicaid drugs, which account for 75% of the drugs Ohio buys, already get a 23.1% federally mandated discount, which is extremely close, you'll note, to the 24% discount that the VA gets. And then just like the VA, Ohio negotiates additional voluntary discounts and rebates with the drug companies. The bottom line is that Ohio is already negotiating drug prices, and according to the Medicaid directors, we're already paying close to what the VA pays for the vast majority of drugs we buy. But if passing issue 2 results in the loss of those voluntary discounts, as the Medicaid directors warn might happen, Ohio's costs could actually go up by tens of millions of dollars a year. But that's not the only thing that's going to cost you money as a taxpayer. There's also issue 2's second paragraph, which I hope all of you will read for yourselves before you vote. That paragraph gives issue 2's 4 sponsors, 3 of whom work for the California fellow who's bankroll in their campaign, an unprecedented right to hire their own lawyers and intervene in any legal challenges that may be filed against the initiative if it becomes law. Even worse, it requires Ohio taxpayers to pay the sponsor's attorney's fees with no cap or limit, whether they win or lose. And since everyone agrees that Issue 2 would be a magnet for lawsuits, a blank check like that would potentially put Ohio taxpayers on the hook for literally millions of dollars. So for all those reasons and more, I urge you to vote no. Issue 2 is nothing less than a prescription for disaster. Thank you very much.
Mr. Butland was 2 seconds over, so I guess he took Mr. Borges' time. I'm sure we'll make it up in the end. But in the meantime, Dr. Silvers, if anything you'd like to add to this?
Sure. Let me try a little. Let me try a little bit.
Make sure you're speaking to the back of the room too.
I prepared for this today by going to give blood today. I thought that was probably the most appropriate thing to do. The only trouble is, if I keel over sometime in the evening, don't know whether it's because of the power of the arguments or my dehydration. So I'm well hydrated up here. We'll share. Yeah, you hear it from me too. This is an interesting, very interesting issue, and it's one that I think is most interesting because it isn't really obvious which side the politicians of various stripes might come down on. But the way that it's been played out, particularly in the ads, but to some extent in the statements so far, is a battle between anger and fear. So if I'm really mad at the drug companies, vote yes. If I'm afraid that the drug companies will make us all pay more because of their market power, then I'll vote no. That is, in my book, a very shallow set of arguments. So I'm hoping, since I'm the neutral party here, that we can get to the underlying questions that I think are much more serious than those two, although I understand, coming from business school, the marketing power of those two emotional thrusts. The real issue, I think, and we heard a little bit of this on both sides, is the problems of implementation. Can you actually implement this? And the issues about market power. So those are the two underlying questions, I think, that really have to be addressed. Is this workable? Can you make it? Can you put it together in a way that's actually going to work? And secondly, how strong are the drug companies in terms of their market power, in terms of their ability to get whatever they want, either directly in the marketplace or indirectly in terms of their lobbying power with the legislature and the administrative process. So I'm hoping in the discussion, and I'll try to intervene as it seems appropriate today, to push the parties in terms of what I think are the more serious kinds of issues that we'll have to talk about. I was on a panel last week, and they were asking me how I was going to vote, and I said, well, I'm actually going to be on a panel with the League of Women Voters on Tuesday night. So by the end of that evening, I will hopefully make up my mind as to how I vote on this thing. So we'll see. Let's see if it works out that way. The three elements, though, of how this works. One is legislation, and I want to ask both parties about this as we go along. And the legislation in this case is pretty short. It's a page and a half. It's not a very long document at all, as some legislation goes. But the second after legislation is regulation. So you put things in practice by writing regulations, and there's a process of comment periods and such. So whatever comes out of this, these arguments to some extent are premature because they will be implemented by regulation, that the process that we go through and to make any law work. And the third is litigation. So when there's a controversy, then it goes to court. And until we go through all three of those steps, we probably won't have the real answers to any of these questions tonight. So I want you to have that in perspective. The law itself won't answer all the questions. But the question is, can we fill in the holes with the other two steps in a way that doesn't bankrupt the state or is inappropriate and difficult for the drug companies? So we can't deal with those. We can't deal with the bigger issue, the issues of campaign finance reform and redistricting that drive the political process. That's not on the ballot. We can't deal with the market power of drug companies that we give them for good purposes through the patent law. We give them monopoly power that gives them absolute power to charge what they want. And then we let them into the Treasury and say, please be careful about how much you take away. This is a little bit of a problem. We're not talking about market power and through the patent process. So what we're talking about here is a first step down a long path among those 3 steps that I mentioned before, and the broader question of how we're going to treat drugs in society. So those are the big questions that I'd have, and I can't wait to have these guys convince me one way or the other. So with that, let me end and turn it back over to you.
We'll get right to it then, I guess. So I'll be posting some questions. In the meantime, feel free to turn in your cards. I already have a small stack here, so don't forget to submit your questions. But in time, I'll start with Mr. Borges down here. So a lot of pro-issue 2 advocates say that there would be like a ripple effect. So this would not just affect this wouldn't just help people who are state employees or benefiting from state prescription drug plans, that it would also benefit the public at large. Can you talk about how that would work and how the public at large through private insurance plans could benefit from this?
Yes, that's a great question, and thank you for asking that. It's a very good point, and it's a well-taken point that a lot of the proponents of issue 2 are talking about that ripple effect through the marketplace. But you know who else says there'll be a ripple effect through the marketplace? The drug companies say that. They said it in their own analysis in a trade publication when they were talking to each other. So in their analysis of the language that was on the ballot in California a year ago, which is essentially identical to the language that's on the ballot now, they said, regardless, here's the point. If the voters approve this proposition, it would establish an incredibly deep mandatory discount for the public purchase of prescription drugs. Such an action would no doubt cause an immediate demand for the same pricing from other states, the federal government, and private insurers as well. So when Dale asked that question before about who benefits, well, if you don't get your drugs through a state program, he knows that that's not true. He knows that what the drug companies are afraid of, what they actually fear, is that once there is a demand for this in the marketplace, once voters take the power into their own hands and go out and instruct policymakers to enact these measures and take these issues seriously that people are clamoring for, that there will be a ripple effect through the marketplace. As you hear these arguments from the opposition, keep these questions in mind. One of the things that the drug companies say, the drug companies campaign to defeat this issue say all the time, is that, oh, it's not going to save anyone any money. It doesn't bring your prices down. Oh, we already get the lowest price we could possibly get. Well, if that were true, then why would they need to threaten to raise prices on everyone else? Why would they threaten seniors? Why would they threaten veterans? Why would they need to do that? Let me ask you this. Why would they spend $126 million to defeat this issue in California? Why are they spending $2 million a week on television right now, to confuse voters, muddy the issue, and take the focus away from what this is all about, bringing drug prices down? That's why. The question that Jeremy just asked is why. Because not only does it put $400 million back into our budget immediately so that we can do things like give more money to schools, maybe give more money to local governments, cut taxes. We didn't get a tax cut in this last budget. We cut $1 billion out of the budget this past year. Didn't get a tax cut. Didn't get a tax cut we were hoping to get. We could do those things, but instead we have to fork that money over to the drug companies because they can charge whatever they want.
All right, great. Anyone, Mr. Butland, would you like a rebuttal?
Yeah. So we've already established, and I think it's very important that people understand, And you notice that Matt didn't contradict any of the things I told you about what the state is already getting. There is a mandated, federally mandated 23.1% discount that Medicaid drugs get. Medicaid drugs account for 75% of the drugs we buy. That's very close to the 24%. So this ridiculous idea that we're going to get these hundreds of millions of dollars in savings is preposterous on its face. There's a less than 1% difference in the mandated discounts with regard to people who aren't covered under this. Now, Matt says, and Matt and I have been doing this so much now, we almost know each other's lines. But Matt says over and over again, oh, the evil, greedy drug companies, they're threatening you. They're going to raise your prices if you do this. Professor Silvers here is at the business school. Now, let me ask you this question. If you tell a company, whether that company makes drugs, or whether they make automobiles, or they make television sets, or they make anything, that they have to sell their product to a certain segment of the population at a low price, lower than market price, what happens to prices for people who aren't covered under that edict?
All right.
So what I'm telling you is cost shifting isn't some nefarious scheme dreamed up by the drug companies. It's basic economics, which is something Matt, when he was chairman of the Ohio Republican Party, used to understand until someone was paying him not to understand it.
But Jeremy, I think this deserves just a little bit more discussion really quickly. Because there is no free market in this space, folks. When one side is prohibited from negotiating a price with a drug company, that's not a free market. That's the system being rigged against you. Okay? And so this idea that well, of course we would raise prices on everyone else. Thank you, Dale, for just admitting that, and we'll get the videotape on that later. Guys, when this discount was mandated on the VA, the drug companies didn't raise prices on everyone else then.
All right.
You know why? Because they care a lot about the regulatory environment that they're in.
All right. So let's first of all let's get Dr. Silvers in.
Oh yes.
Who hasn't had a chance to weigh in at all.
Well, I do think it's a bizarre argument that if you don't, if you make me pay you, it's a bizarre argument that that if you force me to buy drugs for less, if you pay me a lower amount, that I'm going to raise rates on everybody else. That is sort of a strange sort of argument that on its face seems to say something about market power of the drug companies, particularly given that the drug companies have the highest margin of any industry in the country, unequivocally. Close to them is investment managers, but other than that, and since I teach finance, that's close to my heart. But the fact is, drug companies have historically had monopoly profits. There's just no question about that. And they've been able to use their market power. Now, again, this is not about that. That is an issue of federal policy about patents, and that's not in the legislation. But to say that I'm going to raise rates on everybody else because you're going to make me pay less and the margins are so high to begin with, is a little bit of a strange argument. And on its face, says something about the market power of the drug companies. So this is where the anger part comes in. If you're really angry about that, then you might want to vote for this thing just because I want to stick it to them somehow or another and hope that they don't come after me with higher prices on my own plan. Would they come after you for higher prices in your own plan? It's not clear. That's an issue, ambiguous.
So I didn't realize.
Real quick.
Yeah, I didn't realize I would be debating two people here tonight, but that's all right. But that's all right. That's all right. Let me.
Dale, we'll get to you. Just 1 second. I got a question for you. So we'll. It's been said that some drug companies may stop selling drugs or some drugs in Ohio if this passes. Which drugs would be not sold here anymore? How much do we know about that, and can you talk about that argument?
Well, all we know is that this ballot initiative can only limit what the state pays for a product. No ballot initiative can require a manufacturer to sell the product at that price, right? So I could easily see, and by the way, Matt says, well, why would the drug companies be spending all this money to defeat this thing if this wasn't going to really cut into their money? Well, I can think of several reasons. One might be that the VA discount was supposed to be, when Congress passed it, it was supposed to be for veterans, military veterans, in honor of their service and sacrifice. It was never intended to be for everybody. And so I'm going to guess that one reason the drug companies might oppose this is, yes, they don't want to see that precedent set. I might add, by the way, as Matt said, a virtually identical version of this ballot issue was on the ballot last year in the state of California, arguably one of the most progressive states in the country. Not arguably one of the most, arguably the most progressive state. It went down in California by 6 points. And not only that, every single major newspaper in the state, including liberal papers like the LA Times and the San Francisco Chronicle, all editorialized against it. In Ohio, there's only been 3 papers this year so far that have weighed in: the Cleveland Plain Dealer, the Columbus Dispatch, and the Akron Beacon Journal. They have all editorialized against issue 2 and urged a no vote. Now, did the drug companies buy all the editorial boards too? Maybe the problem is with this ballot initiative. Maybe the problem isn't with California voters or the newspapers. Maybe it's the ballot initiative itself, which every expert who has studied it says it's not going to keep its promises. It's not going to do what it promises. It's going to backfire and make things worse. As for what the professor just said a moment ago, yeah, it's true. Yeah, I get it. People are mad at the drug companies. But whatever you think of the drug companies, whatever you think of the prices they charge or the salaries they pay themselves, please understand, folks, that's not on the ballot this fall in the state of Ohio. Right. What is on the ballot is a very specific piece of legislation that, if the experts are right, is going to do very bad things for you in our state.
Mr. Borges,
so let's just keep in mind what the question was. The question was, which drugs wouldn't be made available to you anymore? Well, first of all, the answer is none. That would not happen. It doesn't happen. It didn't happen to the VA. And it's not going to happen in Ohio. Drug companies aren't going to risk that. They're not going to risk the PR. They're not going to risk the public policy backlash. They're not going to risk thumbing their nose at the will of the voters. They're not going to risk not being able to sell these things in this marketplace because, trust me, at the 24% discount, they make a very handsome profit as well. And so here's the point, though. When he asked the question of Dale, he started talking about newspapers in California because they literally will want to talk about anything besides bringing your drug prices down. Anything besides that issue, because they know they lose that issue, so they will try to talk about anything. That's why you see TV commercials about lawsuits, about CEOs, about ballot language, about all kinds of things, because the one issue they don't want to talk about is bringing relief to people who need it, who need to pay less for drugs. And the people who are charging those high drug prices are the drug companies who do all kinds of terrible things to Ohioans. I'm sure we'll get into a lot of that.
Dr. Silvers, what do you think?
Well, let me redeem myself since he thinks I'm biased here. In one of my many extracurricular activities, I was CEO of Qual Choice Health Plan here in Cleveland for a period of time. And so I have firsthand knowledge of dealing with the drug industry. I had no idea how complicated drug pricing was until I was actually involved in it. And it's a mess, I'll tell you. It's just all over the place. Discounts, rebates, all sorts of things. And I had to take some stands on that. I cut us out of Rite Aid because they weren't willing to negotiate. I fought with our pharmacy benefit management company because they weren't passing through the rebates that we were getting. This is all below the waterline. No one knows how this works. It is very complicated. The problem, I think, here with who gets what drugs and what's cut out, and the thing that bothered me from the first time I read the legislation and then the analysis was what is the implementation? How do we make this thing work? When I go to, in a marketplace, you have to have a buyer and seller. Nobody's mandating anything. You have to have agreement to have a transaction. And so when I go to the manufacturer and I say, I want this discount, and they say no, then what's my alternative? What is the enforcement mechanism for this thing? Or am I going to be left with an issue of not getting drugs from one part or the other? Inevitably, the administrative process has to deal with that, has to come up with rules for what happens when the negotiation isn't fruitful, when you can't come to agreement.
So actually, the question I was going to pose to you is kind of along these lines. Like, it seems that there are many unanswered questions about, for example, whether Ohio's public pension retirees would be able to be eligible for this. Can you talk about what we do not know about this ballot issue if it is enacted?
Well, there are a lot of things. Again, I think it's early. The legislative language is is not fleshed out very much, but that's not unusual. So it's how we administer it. What are the regulations that are really going to be the driver on this? And again, full disclosure, I'm on the board of the Metro Health Medical Center, and we get major discounts through the 340B program, which is the discount that we mentioned earlier. I guess you mentioned it, for Medicaid. The 340B program is really important to the public hospitals in the country and the state. Anyone that are what are called disproportionate share, take care of a large number of poor patients. What would happen to that? Yeah, I can't get a clear answer. I've asked lots of people, what do you think would be the impact on the 340B program? And you get conflicting answers. It's not clear. Much of what the other parties that are at debate here, again, it's not clear. And that would be specified in regulation and then undoubtedly would be litigated. So again, we're in the process of at least a 3-stage process to find out how this thing actually works. Are you going to stand for that? Are you willing to go through that process to get to what we hope will be the answer in terms of lower drug prices? Or on the other hand, is this too expensive way to get to where you hope you'll wind up? That's the debate, I think.
You have a little bit of time, but I guess the heart of the answer is, what effect overall do you think this will have both on state employees in terms of their prescription drug prices and also the rest of us?
Me?
Yeah.
I think there are very few that are unambiguous, and state employees are one. I think state employees would get a break. I think it's fairly clear on that one.
All right. Great. Yeah, absolutely.
Because the state employees don't feel that way, Professor, which is why they told the plain dealer not too long ago. Now, we're talking about the heads of the 5 Ohio state retirement plans. There are 468,000 pensioners among them. All of them told the plain dealer, oh, no, we wouldn't have to be included in this. And I don't blame them. They don't.
It's current employees, I think. That's unambiguous.
For current employees, that is true. We're talking about retirement plans now.
Well, that's what wasn't the question.
Well, continue, please.
So the 5 retirement plans all say they're not included in this. Matt's folks and our side, frankly, says we think you are based on what their legislation says. So what happens? The first rattle out of the box, this is what I was telling you, this is going to be a magnet for lawsuits. First rattle out of the box, there's going to be a lawsuit. Are these people in or are they out? And they're not the only ones. That's just the first rattle out of the box. But that's what I say. This thing is so sloppily drafted, so poorly conceived. And as the professor says, you got all these problems with it. You can't know what the lowest price is. That's what the ballot initiative is. Well, maybe we can, by regulation, maybe we can figure out some way to make it work. The only way you can make that work is to change the language of the law.
All right. Let's go to Mr. Borges.
Speaking of the Cleveland Plain Dealer, there was an excellent article in yesterday's paper written by a gentleman named Seth Richardson, who is a fine journalist. And I'm only saying that because he's in the room. No, I'm saying that because I think he's a fine journalist. And so he couldn't tell he couldn't get to the bottom of which side was telling the truth. The yes campaign, which is on the side of the angels, or the no campaign, which is on the side of telling lies in drug companies. No, but so he called an OSU professor, who was a neutral party in this, and he asked him that question. And you know what the OSU professor said? He said the no side is incorrect when they say the ballot initiative is unworkable. Now look, we might have to have some folks at the state who do, You talked about how convoluted drug pricing can be. Think about the folks at the state of Ohio who have to deal with this through the Medicaid program and whatnot. They do a lot of incredible work. They do a lot of hard work. I've seen the stuff they do to force compliance in a lot of these instances, and they get it done. So you're saying that folks might have to work a little harder to make sure that we get these discounts and these prices? Well, they're not going to get a lot of sympathy from me. they'll work hard. They'll make sure that they get these prices, and that's what will happen.
We'll keep it with you. I wanted to try to see if I can pin you down on how much, if this passes, how much would this save Ohio taxpayers per year?
So the best estimate that we have is right around $400 million, which is what we've been saying all along. But because of some of the unknowns of this, it actually could be a lot more. There's a gentleman here in the front row, Max Melman, who is a distinguished professor at Case Western University, professor of law, who has looked at these issues. By the way, Rhodes Scholar, pretty smart guy, knows what he's doing, and we were pleased to have him take a look at this for us. And he concluded that there are hundreds of millions of dollars, somewhere in the range of $350 to $400 million worth of savings for the state of Ohio, just by imposing this discount on drug companies and what they sell. The state of Ohio purchases $3 billion worth of prescription drugs a year, and there are tens of thousands of drugs that are in those formularies. About 17,000 of those drugs, 17,558, but who's counting exactly, of those drugs are in the VA formulary. And so the state of Ohio would immediately recognize a discount on those drugs. Let me give you one example just really quickly, and then Jeremy can move on. One example. Everyone is familiar with an EpiPen, right? Everyone knows about EpiPens. Everyone's got to, we've got to have one for our kids. You got to have one at school. You got to have one at grandma's. You got to have two at home. And all these things, they run out after a year, so you got to go get another one. I've needed an EpiPen my whole life because I'm allergic to bee stings. 5 years ago, EpiPens cost about $80. Today, they cost $600 or more. But in the VA formulary, they cost $182. And so just on EpiPens, the state of Ohio will save a significant amount. And when you extrapolate that by 17,000 drugs that are in the VA formulary that are online, we know what they pay, we know what they buy, we know what they pay. You start talking about some real savings that the state of Ohio recognizes, and that's the way we can get some flexibility. That's why the taxpayers care about this, so we can get flexibility back in our budgeting.
Well, so let me try to take these in order. With respect to Professor Melman's study, and by the way, he is a lovely man and an extraordinarily capable man, and I've actually known him for a lot more years than Matt has, because I worked with him on another project many years ago. But in truth, Professor Melman's study did not find itself that there would be all this savings. This savings, this alleged savings of up to $350 million, the evidence for that was a single footnote that referenced another study done by another professor at Case, whose name is Murray. That study that Dr. Murray produced was analyzed by these former Medicaid directors and state budget director I told you about. You can see it on our website, which is nooneissue2.org. Suffice it to say that they found lots of problems with Professor Murray's study. The next thing I want to talk about is...
in 20 seconds.
Well, now, come on now. You gave him a lot more time than that, okay?
And I'm giving you more time than that.
So, with regard to Sept's article in the Cleveland Plainer, which I have here, this was yesterday's piece. What Matt kind of mischaracterized that a little bit. One of the main arguments over issue 2 was whether the VA's pricing is publicly available. At the Plain Dealer, we set out to settle the issue once and for all, and a spokeswoman for the VA gave a simple answer. Some pharmaceutical contracts between the VA and private companies are not public record, okay? Finally, the EpiPen. They have an ad on the air right now, and this is an example of just how misleading this campaign is. They have a mother on there. You've probably seen the ad. The mom says, I need to buy an EpiPen for my child.
Good ad, isn't it?
I need to buy an EpiPen for my child, and I have this big deductible, right? And the price has gone up. We know she has private insurance because she says she has a big deductible. Well, what they don't tell you is, what they conveniently leave out, is that because she's not covered under issue 2 would not reduce by 1 penny what she has to pay for the EpiPens.
Now let's go to Dr. Silvers.
Oh, boy. Did you ever wander into the wrong bar into the middle of an accident?
I'm
kind of feeling like the Star Wars bar scene here, to tell you the truth.
No.
That's a whole other discussion.
The essence of this is, and we tend to lose track of this is called reference pricing. And reference pricing is not a new idea, it's an old idea. And most places in the world, when a drug is introduced, you can't just sort of set whatever price you want like you can in the United States. You have to do it within a band around the existing drugs in that same class. That's the standard way. The drug industry has fought against that constantly from the very beginning for obvious reasons. You don't want to lose flexibility. As a business person, you want to have the maximum flexibility. The question is this the right way to do reference pricing? Is this the way to keep these extraordinarily high rates that are particularly for specialty drugs? If anybody has to do the specialty drug, it's been far worse than others. But in general, any drug has gone up, almost all of them. So could you make it work? Is this a good base for reference pricing? Is this the fair market way to do it? The argument, I think, on the one side is the VA's got more market power than anybody else out there. They've got good prices. They've done a good job. Let's do reference pricing off of that one. I buy that 100%. I think that's a perfectly rational way to put yourself into a market that otherwise doesn't have many market forces going in your favor as a consumer. So that's a legitimate beginning point. Again, the real question is, can you do it? So that's the fundamental question. Right. And can you do it practically right now, or could you do it with enough regulations to define the loose ends on this law?
All right, Mr. Butland. So a lot of the arguments you've been making tonight involve potential consequences for Ohio, such as litigation, potential litigation, or the likelihood of litigation, higher drug prices, just for frankly everyone around the state. A lot of those consequences would come from pharmaceutical companies, a lot of whom are, or many of whom are opposing this and airing ads saying that they would do the consequences that they're warning against. Like, how would you explain that to people, and why would pharmaceutical companies want to follow through on those, I don't want to call them threats, but warnings?
Well, you know, as I tried to say before, perhaps not very well, but let me try it again. Cost shifting is basic economics. It's economics 101. That's what happens. Ask yourself this. If you tell a bar down the street, or a restaurant, let's make it a restaurant. You tell a restaurant, you've got to give a 25% discount to women who walk in. What happens to the prices for the men then that walk in? Isn't that restaurant likely to increase those prices through
you get to charge more because of all the women there.
Through cost shifting, yeah. Cost shifting is basic economics. This, as I said before, it is not some nefarious scheme dreamed up by the greedy drug companies, which, by the way, that's what you're going to hear over and over from Matt, the greedy drug companies.
Yes. You will hear that.
Yeah, but because as somebody at the Plain Dealer told me before they wrote their editorial opposing issue 2, he said, so let me see if I have this straight, and I think I do. Your side, the no side, has the facts, reason, and logic. The other side has the EpiPen. And that's exactly right. They have an emotional issue which they demagogue to high heaven. But I'm just telling you, folks, be very careful before you vote. Get the facts, read up on this, because the last thing you want to do is vote for something that's going to make the problem worse.
Well, since we're talking about, I guess, quotes from people who, you know, Dale says happened, let me read you a quote here that you might want to take into consideration here as you're listening to us tonight. Pharma and the big drug companies will do, and Pharma, by the way, is the lobbying organization that right now is paying Dale Butland and a lot of other people to oppose this campaign, even though they won't disclose who their donors are. Pharma and the big drug companies will do anything to try to preserve what they regard as their right to gouge consumers and stall meaningful relief for average people. You know who said that? Dale Butland did, when he was working on one of these issues. So he knows who he's dealing with. He knows who the people are that are paying him now. This idea that cost shifting happens everywhere. That women in the bar, great example, Dale. But he said we could give each other speech. I wouldn't have come up with that one if I had been doing his part. First of all, that cost shifting argument didn't happen to the VA. That didn't happen. They didn't raise prices on everyone else. Why? Because Congress was watching them.
All right.
The policymakers had just spoken, and they care a lot about how they're regulated, their patent laws, the other things that you've mentioned. They don't do that. They can't just decide to raise prices on everyone else. So first of all, understand, when you see that argument being made on TV, that's not a campaign ad. That's a hostage video. That's them saying, we're going to punish you if you dare take the power into your own hands to cut into our profits.
Right, we'll give because you mentioned Mr. Butland, we'll give him like 15 seconds to respond to that.
I told you folks at the beginning that I've spent a good part of my working life in the fight for affordable prescription drugs. The quote that Mac just mentioned, it's true, I said that. 15 years ago, when I was involved in an effort headed by the Ohio AFL-CIO that was designed to have Ohio negotiate prescription drug prices. Now, that particular issue did not end up on the ballot. It ended up in a negotiation with the pharmaceutical industry. And it led, unlike this thing, which is not going to help anybody, it led to the creation of Ohio's Best RX program. If you're old enough to have a golden Buckeye card, it's right on, no, not okay. Let me finish my point, okay? Right on the back of your golden Buckeye card is the Ohio's Best RX card. It's still in effect today, and it's still bringing help and hope to people who don't have insurance. The big difference between what I was involved in and this is that we didn't try to mandate an artificial price control. We were involved in a negotiation which Ohio now does.
All right, let's bring Dr. Silvers in here.
Well, let me go back to Dale's comment. The idea of cost shifting as a basic part of economics. It's a basic part of economics, but it's evidence of market failure. Because market prices are supposed to determine what you pay when you go to the gas station or the grocery store or anyplace else. When the seller has the ability to do what's called discriminatory pricing, to charge different rates for different people, that is a classical economic picture of monopoly power. There's just no question the drug companies have monopoly power. They do. Now, are they going to use it well? Are they going to use it to the benefit of society or not? I think there's been, for most of the history of the drug industry, they've used it to the benefit of society. We've got drugs that we wouldn't have otherwise. They've used it for research and such. We've come up with lots of good stuff. Is this going to damage that? Is this going to artificially force other people to pay more? That's the $64 question. And it's not clear to me. I think the arguments on both sides are ones that we have to weigh carefully. Would the drug companies take the public abuse of, in fact, raising prices so much on everybody else that it's noticeable, or would they do it through multiple mechanisms, or would they just absorb this? I don't know. That's a fundamental question, I think.
All right, so it's a couple minutes before 8. We're going to go to your questions. I'm just answering them in the order. I'll just be, I'm going to weed out, just so you guys know, if there's a redundant question that is exactly like the one that someone has already fielded, I'm going to do that. And I might edit it for brevity, but other than that, I'll try to get to as many of your questions as I can. Why don't we do it? We'll just go down the list. Why don't we give everyone 2 minutes each to answers? We'll just start with Mr. Butland and just work our way down, and then we'll go down the list. So first question is, I've been increasingly politically active over the years, and I pride myself on informing myself about political issues, but I couldn't be more confused. Bernie Sanders, Nina Turner, and the former head of the Ohio Republican Party all advocate for a yes vote, while John Glenn's former aide says no. How can this issue be cutting across party lines so dramatically? How is it happening, Dale?
Because it's not an ideological issue. There are actually Democrats and Republicans on both sides of this issue. On Matt's team, they have Democrats and Republicans. On our side, we have Democrats and Republicans. All I can tell you, I can't speak for anybody else. I can simply speak for myself. And I can tell you that after I worked for John Glenn for 20 years, one of the first jobs I had after that was what I just told you about a moment ago, advocating with the Ohio AFL-CIO for lower drug prices. I've never taken a job in my life that I didn't believe in. I honestly believe that this ballot initiative is flawed and bad public policy that will redound to the detriment of our state and its people. And that is why I am opposed to it.
Right. Dr. Silvers.
I've almost lost the question.
So this crossed so many political
Yeah.
divides, Republicans, Democrats, it's all in the blender.
I find that refreshing, that we're actually having people from both sides argue. So I'm not bothered by that at all.
Okay, one of the few areas that Dale and I are going to agree tonight. No, just kidding. Dale and I have known each other for a long time, and we get along well. I had been talking about this issue a lot, and I kept referring to our issue that we have a bipartisan team. We really don't. That's really actually not true. This is a nonpartisan issue. You know, I came to this fight because I'm a father of a special needs child, diagnosed very early, well, recognized very early at 2 years old, not diagnosed for another year and a half or so, and my family, we're very fortunate. Okay. In that intermediate period of time, we were able to get my daughter care that she needed before insurance covered, before we had an official diagnosis, before county services kicked in. We could afford to do that, and that early intervention was so critically important for her being a productive first grader now. But it really opened our eyes to the challenges that so many of these families face when these beautiful little babies need this care and need this early intervention, and the parents have to wait a long time. So we've led the fundraising drive for Columbus Speech and Hearing for the last few years, and are very involved in Autism Speaks, and it was an eye-opening experience. The number one issue that prevents people from being able to access the care that they need is the price of prescription drugs. Autism, which affects my daughter, I recognize is not one of those ailments that you deal, one of those conditions that you deal with prescription drugs. But it did open our eyes to the struggles that many, many people have. And so we need to do anything and everything we can to put the leverage back in your hands, okay? Give the power back to you to say to our policymakers in Columbus who haven't taken these issues up, to the folks in Washington, D.C. who are not doing their job to make sure you get the price relief that you need. That's the idea here, and that's something that can cut across all political strands.
All right, this is a question that we've touched on a little bit, but not too much. It's a two-parter, and I'll condense it to one, which is who is backing issue 2 and why, and who is against issue 2 and why. And why don't we start, because we started with Dale, we'll start with Dr. Silvers now. Who's for it and who's against it and why?
Well, that's a good question. I think it's sort of, again, unknowable because not all the donors are obvious, but it's pretty clear that the anti-side is from the drug industry. The money's clearly come from Big Pharma, and that's not surprising. That's exactly what you'd expect. The pro side is a little more ambiguous, and perhaps you're probably better fixed to say something about who's on the pro side.
Yeah, the AIDS Healthcare Foundation is the primary funder of the Yes campaign, and AIDS Healthcare Foundation has a facility here in Cleveland. They've treated 17,000 Ohioans, regardless of their ability to pay. They're led by a true humanitarian, a gentleman who helped bring generic drugs to the African continent to help fight the scourge of AIDS that was killing tens of millions of people in Africa. We then had the African AIDS Initiative under the Bush administration, largely because of what Michael Weinstein has done. Because of his relentless pursuit of trying to make sure that people get access to care regardless of their ability to pay, drug companies hate him. They despise him. And they're up on television right now with $2 million a week trying to turn him into something that he is absolutely not. And it's despicable what they're doing to this man. It's unbelievable to someone who has provided a public service and fought for the rights of patients his entire career. And so they're up on TV right now flashing his face, saying his name, trying to make sure you hear, all these bad things about him, reinforcing negative stereotypes, calling the people who are the petitioners who are African American his gang. This is the kind of campaign that the other side is running right now because They are funded by the pharmaceutical industry, and the pharmaceutical industry will do absolutely anything to protect what, like Dale said, they believe is their fundamental right to deny people the ability to get lower drug prices.
Mr. Butland.
So who's on the yes side? Professor Silver's comment notwithstanding, it is not only the drug companies. As I mentioned to you when I was speaking before, 70 different statewide organizations, business, labor, veterans, virtually every medical organization in the state save one, which I can get to in a moment. Over 30,000 Ohio doctors, pharmacists, hospitals. Why would all those people be against this? They see this problem every day with their patients. They understand the need for affordable prescription drugs. They think this is going to make it worse. With regard to the other side and Mr. Weinstein, and I don't want to demonize Mr. Weinstein into saying that he's never done anything good. Yes, he has done some good work. But before we canonize him and make him Saint Michael, there's a few things you ought to know about Mr. Weinstein. Mr. Weinstein runs a $1 billion foundation called the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. Now, it's a nonprofit, doesn't pay taxes. How does it get to be a $1 billion foundation? Well, he buys drugs really cheaply under the 340B program, but he doesn't pass those savings on to the people who have insurance. When he bills the insurance companies, he bills them at full price. And so the difference between what he gets reimbursed and what he pays for the drug is how it becomes a $1 billion a year foundation. The other thing you should know about Mr. Weinstein is that right here in Cleveland, earlier this year, in March, you can read about it in the Plain Dealer. They've had lots of stories about it. Mr. Weinstein and the organization here in the city wanted to get a grant from the Ohio Department of Health to treat HIV/AIDS patients. They didn't get the grant because their application was late, it was full of mistakes and errors, and they have a history of noncompliance. So the Ohio Department of Health didn't give them the grant, the contract. So what did they do? What did Weinstein do? He sued the Ohio Department of Health, but not just that. He also wanted a restraining order that would have prohibited the granting of any of the money to any of the organizations until his lawsuit was settled. Fortunately, a judge said, sorry, Mr. Weinstein, that is not in the public interest to deny the very people that your organization exists to serve, HIV/AIDS patients. It's not going to do anybody any good to keep drugs from going to them. So, and she said you're unlikely to win the underlying suit in any event. But that's Mr. Weinstein. Let's tell the whole story about him, Matt. The whole story.
All right.
Yes, because one lawsuit tells the whole story about
No,
someone.
he did the same thing in Louisiana last year.
All right. So, speaking of, the next question is: are there laws on the books in other states? And if so, and I believe the answer is no, but Matt, could you talk about that? Does this have ramifications beyond Ohio, and is there anything like this outside of Ohio right now?
Yeah, there's one thing outside of Ohio. It's the VA. That applies to everyone in the country, which is another reason why this notion that that somehow, I mean, that's federal legislation. That's federally mandated. Somehow that the drug companies would have the power to raise prices on everyone else. Well, not on the VA, they wouldn't, because that's already federally mandated. And yes, every single attempt that states have made, because look, if you're waiting around for the federal government to fix this problem, don't hold your breath. Okay. All kinds of states around the country have tried to enact reforms. They've tried to do things with regard to price transparency, all kinds of things that would help this market actually become a free market. And in every one of those instances that they passed in Nevada, they passed in Louisiana, they passed in Maryland, and the drug companies sue. They immediately run to court and they say, oh, please, we might have to pay more money. It's one of those things where they figure out what's worth more to them, filing a lawsuit and paying a lot of money, or having these states actually be able to get control of their prices, and then folks, everyday Ohioans, everyday folks around the country could actually see some relief. One thing that's been brought up a couple times, and I know we got to wrap up here, but is this 340B program that you talked about. The 340B program, ladies and gentlemen, is on the chopping block. It has nothing to do with our issue, nothing. And so the 340B program keeps Cleveland Metro open. community hospitals.
Not quite that.
All right.
Well, allows them to service their patients. And right now, the federal government is proposing that the 340B program end, and so that those folks will not have that option in the marketplace anymore. Why? Not because they care about patients, ladies and gentlemen.
Let's get to Mr. Butland.
Matt just said to you a moment ago that if this thing passes, nothing bad's going to happen to veterans, right? Well, how about we listen to what the VA itself says? Now, the VA, because it's a federal agency, does not get involved in state ballot fights. They don't take positions. But last year, when this same thing was on the ballot in California, they were asked to do an issue brief as to what the impact would be on the VA and therefore on veterans' prices if something like this passed in the states of California or Ohio. And the VA found, and you can read this too on our website, noonissue2.org, the VA issue brief found that if this passed, those voluntary discounts that we talked about before, those are likely going to go away, and the VA's cost, the VA estimates, would increase by nearly $4 billion a year. So when Matt tells you, oh, you don't have to worry about veterans, that's not what the veterans themselves say. That's why every veterans organization in this state has endorsed our side. It's why a former VA director, Anthony Principe, who is the Secretary of Veterans Affairs under President George W. Bush, says that this is a dagger aimed at the heart of 840,000 Ohio veterans, and it's why he's urging a no vote. Every veterans organization is as well. So, you know, well, it is true, and
It actually isn't.
If you're going to
We
talk
have veterans
about
on our
you're
side.
talking about no, I'm not talking about individual veterans.
No,
I'm talking
groups
about
also.
veterans organizations.
Veterans organizations.
Yeah, name one.
Vote vets.
That's not a state organization, my friend.
You said every veterans
I
organization.
said every state veterans organization. But anyway, they've got one. Look, they've got one state organization that has endorsed them. One. Exactly one.
All right, Dr. Silvers.
I'm in the bar fight again. This is incredible. Again, this is a very complicated issue. Let me comment on a couple of things here. The 340B program is a very bizarre program that was instituted to try to help out institutions that provide care to poor people. It was for disproportionate share hospitals like Metro, but it's been extended to ambulatory centers, neighborhood health practice, for instance, in Cleveland, Neon, places like that, for the same reason, so that you can get lower priced drugs and pass them through so that the cost of purchasing the drugs through the Medicaid program is less. You also have the ability to buy those drugs for the non-Medicaid population and sell them and mark them up and sell them at a higher rate to commercial insured populations. That's what happens with most hospitals is they make a significant amount of money that they then use to cross-subsidize care to poor people. That happens at Metro, it happens at neighborhood practice, and it happens at the AIDS center too. So the fact that they're big in the 340B program is there's nothing wrong with that. That's the way the program was designed. Now, with my public policy hat on, I think that's a really strange, backward way to subsidize care to poor people. But that's what the law is right now. So I definitely wouldn't go after the AIDS Foundation for that. The broader question, I think, is what we've talked about here. How well would this work? Can you, in fact, actually make it work? And so I really don't think the issue is so much who is funding one side or the other. The question is, what's the power of the argument? And that goes back to what's going to happen in this competitive marketplace, where we've got two parties that we're trying to force to the table to come to some agreement. And right now, it's unequal one direction. The drug companies clearly have more power. The question is this going to make it more equal on the other side? And when you have somebody with more power on one side versus somebody that has power on the other, will they come to an agreement? Or is it going to break down and it'll be like trying to talk to North Korea? It's just not clear what's going to happen here, I think.
I'm going to kind of merge, there's a lot of questions like this, so I'm going to kind of merge these questions together. And I forget who we left off with. Did we leave off with Matt leading off? I think so. So we'll go back to Dale. Top of the order. So I'll combine these. So the question on the card is, how will issue 2 affect seniors who are now benefiting from the Affordable Care Act? And I'm going to piggyback and say seniors and also specifically people on Medicare.
Yeah. So I tried to address that at the beginning. People who rely on Medicare will not see any benefit at all because you're not included under issue 2. Medicare is not a state program, right? It's a federal program. Federal programs aren't included. So if you're a Medicare recipient that you rely on Medicare, you don't get any benefit from this at all. And let me just go one step further because we're talking about, and I'd like to comment on something the prof said here a moment ago. In my own personal opinion is this. The problem with affordable prescription drugs and the problem with drug pricing is part of a much broader issue we have in this country with regard to health care generally. We have a national problem, and it needs a national answer or solution. We cannot fix this on a piecemeal, state-by-state basis. If you try, you end up with something like this, that virtually every expert who's looked at it says this is not going to work. Sherrod Brown, our senator, is doing lots of good work around this in Washington. I'm told that he's gaining some bipartisan traction there. That's where we ought to be focused in our efforts because it's got to be a national solution. You can't do this on a state-by-state basis.
All right, why don't we go right to Matt, and then we'll go to Dr. Sellers.
Okay, and I hope folks know about what's happening in Washington right now as we speak. And that by the end of this week, maybe by the end of next week, I think, whatever the deadline is, the Affordable Care Act will be no longer. And, oh, folks, I'll tell you, yeah. Yeah.
I think you tried to kill it before, Matt. I don't think it worked. I mean, your party, rather, not you personally.
And, of course, that isn't true, as Dale knows. If you listen to our governor and you listen to a lot of folks in the, I worked for John Kasich. I worked for John McCain. I worked for people who were actually on the other side of that argument.
Killed the Republican effort to kill
who were on the other side of that argument, Dale. So, but
stay on task.
But here's the issue. Here's the issue. One of the arguments that Dale was talking about before was that Medicaid gets a 23% discount, federally mandated. Well, that's in statute in the Affordable Care Act, folks, because it used to be 15%. So when the Affordable Care Act goes away, there are a lot of things that are happening right now, forces beyond our control. Well, not totally beyond our control. You can have your voices heard, and you can try to lobby your senators. You can try to get folks to defeat these measures. It has worked in the past. But the issues here are that, I'll go back to it again. If you're waiting around for the federal, Dale makes a great point. I don't disagree with him about this, that this needs to be a federal solution. There needs to be a national solution to these issues. Don't hold your breath, ladies and gentlemen, because that process doesn't work well for you and me. It doesn't. So what it does is it makes it up to the states to take the power into their hands, and it's up to the voters to take the power into their hands and instruct policymakers what they should take seriously, and they need to start taking these issues much more seriously.
Dr. Sellers.
I think the question was, what effect would this have on Medicare, correct?
Seniors under the Affordable Care Act as well as Medicare.
Seniors under, well, that's Medicare. So,
I thought you said Medicaid. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Can I go back and just address?
The senior was about.
It
was about Medicare.
Can I address Medicare for just one quick second? Again, Medicare is federally prohibited by law from negotiating prices with drug companies. They're not allowed to do that. That is a statute that Congress passed. So again, talking free market forces here. There are none in that space. Every single presidential candidate last year talked about giving the federal government that opportunity.
Dr. Sellers.
I'm going to get it too.
the law will not be affected for Medicare. So on its surface, this would have no impact on Medicare, except Medicare Part D, which is the competitive drug plan, has actually worked pretty well. The competition has worked pretty well to the extent that you folks are right. that this would be a pushback from the drug companies, then the negotiation between the drug plans that you buy, if you buy a Part D plan, and the drug companies would get tilted towards the drug companies, and prices might go up under that one. That isn't at all obvious that would happen, but that would be the fear if you buy the argument from this side. Most of the savings that have come in Part D have come from squeezing the middleman and doing some other things, substituting drugs, doing some other things that Medicare is not allowed to do itself. So the fundamental problem is, what's Medicare's ability to negotiate drugs? And it's zero, except through this backhanded door of trying to get these Medicare Part D drug companies to negotiate better. And from the inside, I'll tell you, that's really hard to get a discount to get much out of the drug companies.
So the answer is it will have zero impact on Medicare, on Medicaid, which can negotiate drug prices and does negotiate drug prices, as we've just been talking about all night long. Remember, what this ballot initiative would do would say that the state of Ohio could not buy any drugs for more than the lowest price paid by the VA. The VA's mandated discount is 24%. Medicaid is 23.1%, less than 1% difference.
All right, this question is, how does Ohio currently negotiate with pharmaceutical companies for the best price? And it asks for a specific example. I don't know if you have an example, but what's the current process for Ohio to negotiate?
Well, take Ohio State, or the probably the easy one. A big employer like Ohio State already negotiates through their insurance company. So they would have some market power, and they would get some negotiation through that. But the insurance company has limited power to negotiate. So you're basically a price taker in the insurance marketplace with regard to drugs. They just don't have enough power to really make any impact. The other is through the if you buy into the fact being the state of Ohio buys drugs through the Medicaid program, and that's sort of a circuitous argument because drugs get bought by the providers with this discount arrangement that we've had here. I'm not sure I'm answering the question because I'm not sure there is an easy answer. There are multiple parties that interact with the drug industry different ways.
Okay. Mr. Borges.
I think the state of Ohio does the best job it possibly can. Dr. Millman's analysis for us showed us that when they're done dealing with all the challenges that they have, they end up paying about 52% of the list price for prescription drugs on average. The VA pays 48%. And so you take that difference, that vigorish, and that's where you come up with the savings that the state would recognize, would realize if they had the power to purchase at the rates that the VA currently pays. And so when it might seem like a small amount, but over 17,000 different drugs and over $3 billion worth of savings, you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars that then go back into the state coffers to do all kinds of things that we could do. One of the things that we could do with that additional money is help fight this opioid epidemic, which, by the way, was started by the drug companies by overprescribing those pain medications there are plenty of examples of doctors who have been paid by drug companies to market those drugs specifically to their patients. There was a story I think it was in the New York Times yesterday, about how there are less addictive pain medications that are available, but insurance companies won't cover those. So instead, what you get are the more addictive ones that are being prescribed to people en masse, and it's an enormous problem that we need to get under control. Now we have this forest fire in Ohio. Okay, let's just set aside who started it. We have this forest fire. It sure would be nice to have more money in our budget so that it's not overextending what local governments have to deal with right now with the amount of people that are suffering and are dying because of this issue. $400 million more in the budget for Ohio gives us a lot more opportunity to get people care and get people cured.
Let me just say that the opioid crisis is real and it's heartbreaking. But let me also point out that even though Matt and his side always tries to demagogue this, not one word in issue 2 deals with the opioid crisis. Not one word deals deals with addiction, treatment, illegal street drugs, or anything else. If they were concerned about the opioid problem, they should have put something on the ballot to address it. They didn't. Right? So now what they're trying to do is piggyback here on this.
All right. So we have time for one more question, and I'll start with Matt down here. So Matt, does the VA cover all drugs, and will Issue 2 cover all prescription drugs?
So Issue 2 covers any drug that the state of Ohio purchases, and it says that it can't pay more for prescription drugs than the VA currently pays. The VA's formulary, which is online, I invite you to go take a look at it. 17,558 different drugs that it covers. It lists those drugs, what they are and what they pay. But the answer is that not every drug that the state of Ohio purchases is in the VA formulary. And so for those drugs that are not in the VA formulary, the state of Ohio continues to pay what it's paid all along. But for those 17,000 drugs that are in that formulary, those prices come down. Those prices are given at that discounted rate. So, you'll hear all kinds of things about the lawsuits the other side wants to file. You'll hear all kinds of things about how terrible they think Michael Weinstein is. You'll hear all kinds of things about lawsuits and ballot language and the issues they want to talk about. But just remember when you go to the polls on November 7th, if you want lower drug prices, you're going to have to vote yes. And excuse me, the people who want you to vote no, who are desperate for you to vote no, are the drug companies who are the only ones who do well in the current environment that we're in. Their message to you is leave everything exactly the way it is. My message to you tonight is take the power into your own hands and instruct our policymakers to start taking these issues seriously.
Let me go back to the original question that was asked about the drugs that Ohio buys that the VA doesn't, and that's a really important question. I'll tell you why. The VA prescribes drugs primarily for military veterans, right? So they have a very narrow formulary compared to what Ohio has. Ohio, in fact, under the Medicaid laws, any Medicaid recipients have to have access to any drug approved by the FDA. Now, Matt will tell you, oh, there's very few drugs that are really not on the VA formulary. So there's a report, you can see this on our website, from the national consulting firm called Avalier, Matt. The VA formulary covers 49% fewer drugs than Ohio's largest managed care program. Managed care programs under Medicaid account for about 80% of the people in Medicaid. Almost half of the drugs that in those managed care programs are not on the VA formulary. Of the ones in the fee-for-service program, which accounts for the rest of the people in Medicaid, 68% fewer drugs. So when Ohio has to buy drugs that aren't on the VA formulary that the VA doesn't buy, now there's no VA price to compare it to. So what happens? Matt says, oh, no problem. You can just pay whatever you're paying for it now. Well, first of all, that's not what the ballot initiative says. It's not even clear to me that Ohio could continue buying those drugs. But let's say Matt's right, and we just keep paying what we're... So where's the savings now, Matt? Now there's no VA discount. So Matt says, oh, you just pay it whatever you can have to buy it for. So what happened to his $400 million savings? It's another example of how illusory this whole $400 million savings is.
All right, Dr. Silvers. Finish us off.
Finish us off. Yes. Oh my gosh. With my public policy hat on, it seems to me like these are workable issues, that we can have regulations to say what happens if it's not on the formulary or if it's on the formulary. The trouble with that is that would lead to litigation. So would it work? It would take a while to get it worked out. Could it work out? Of course. Could it be worked out? Of course. The savings is something I don't particularly buy the $400 million. I don't buy a lower number. I don't buy a higher number. I think it's one that we just don't know. I think the issue is, do you believe that you need to start someplace in terms of market discipline for the drug companies? And is this the place to start? Is this the right way to approach regulation of drug prices, but within a market context? And that's the way I would cast your argument, is this is as good a place as any to start to try to provide some discipline for an industry that otherwise has no market power. On the other hand, I think I can certainly understand the drug business, that they would not want to have this happen. And what they have done for us from a public policy point of view, from a societal point of view, is undeniably good. You know, we've got drugs that we clearly wouldn't have otherwise. So is that going to be damaged? Is there a way for us to have... Oh, my. The library card's after us now. Is there a way for us to achieve this without this kind of legislation? The damaging thing, in my view, and this is as a finance professor from the drug industry, is the really irresponsible behavior, particularly of companies that have come in driven by Wall Street hedge funds and done ridiculous things like Valiant and a number of others. They've pretty much muddied the water for all the drug companies. So if I were in big pharma, I would be mad as hell at those guys that...
those guys are not a part of it.
I know they aren't, but they've flavored this, so the anger is definitely palatable. And the desire to start someplace is a reasonable factor behind your vote on this one. Is it enough to overcome some of the practical issues? That's the one you have to debate.
Great. Well, a big round of applause for our 3 panelists. Thank you so much. If you didn't already, there's more literature propaganda on the table out there. Feel free to go. They have all of websites, and stay tuned to the Cleveland Plain Dealer and Cleveland.com for the coverage. Thank you so much for coming tonight.